will. So I want to talk to you about the black troops fighting in the American Civil War, in particular on the federal side, of course. And what happened here is, and this is just a magnificent color lithograph of probably the most famous fight that black troops took part in, thanks to the movie Glory, with Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman, and Matthew Broderick, and Carrie Elwes. But what happened is that when the Civil War began with the firing on Fort Sumter, what happened was the idea of black troops wasn't on most people's minds, because there was the conventional wisdom that the war was going to be over pretty quickly. The original Union battle plan was on to Richmond. It was a very sophisticated strategy. And in fact, a lot of Union soldiers were actually 90-day volunteers, thinking it would be that short of an affair. The Confederates were slightly more long range, and men signed up for 1 year. And that turned out to prove wildly over-optimistic too. The truth of the matter was it was going to be a much more brutal and prolonged struggle than that, as the two sides squared off. And I think, of course, one of the parts that's really fascinating about it all are the border states. These places that were actually slave states, but did not secede from the Union and actually joined the Confederacy as part of the larger configuration. But the reality of it was that as the conflict bore on, it came pretty evident that manpower would be really key. And so what happened was the call became more and more pronounced for putting black men in uniform to fight for the North and to fight for the restoration of the Union. One of the key figures in all of this was Frederick Douglass. And he, from the start, wanted this to be the case. He regretted that it was at first a white man's war, when he really wanted to see black men step up into the line of fighting too, because he understood that if a black man was accepted as a soldier, then he would also be accepted as a man. And that was essential to getting the idea that the abolition of slavery had to come, and this was its moment. But not at first. Lincoln really soft-pedaled the idea for a number of reasons. Early on, abolitionism was seen as too extreme. And strategically speaking, Lincoln was kind of caught in a bad spot in the fact that Maryland was a slave state that had not seceded. And of course, if Maryland seceded, that would make Washington, D.C. the pickle in the middle. So didn't push that. There was also concerns about would white officers, could you find enough white officers to lead these regiments? And so there was that issue too. And in fact, another big concern was, of course, was that although Lincoln had a number of war Democrats, Northern Democrats who supported the war to restore the Union, he also knew that there wouldn't be any Democrats who would sign off on black troops in battle. And so he didn't want to fracture that part of his fairly fragile early war coalition of Republicans and more Democrats, and calling for black troops would most certainly have threatened that arrangement also. The war Democrats would have not signed off on such a concept. I mean, when you read about how in the first year of the war that some Union commanders sent back runaway slaves to their masters, referring to the runaway slaves as contraband, and returning to their masters almost to a man jack. Those were Democrats by voting preference and by conduct and by background. And so just probably wasn't the wisest thing to stir that pot at the beginning. So what will happen is that nevertheless, despite the reluctance on the part of Lincoln to actually engage the idea of black troops fighting for the North, you do have black civilians, whether free men of color or runaway slaves, being engaged by the Union war effort on some form or fashion. One of the first that was really noteworthy was the Black Brigade of Cincinnati. And this was several thousand fellows who came together in the summer and autumn of 1862 to help defend the city of Cincinnati. This was the time of the Confederate invasion of Kentucky. And what happened was at one point Cincinnati was a legitimate target for the Confederate forces. And the city fathers of Cincinnati organized this really sizable force of freemen of color as a construction brigade. And they built a whole series of entrenchments and fire pits and things like that, and artillery emplacements to help defend the city against a potential Confederate attack, which did not materialize, and yet they still were there making their contribution, and in a civilian fashion. You also have here, this is a fellow here, this is at St. Petersburg in 1864, and he is serving as a cook. Cooks, wagon drivers, construction crews, number of black women served as nurses in the hospitals. This here is also 1864. This is the docks at Alexandria, Virginia. And so you have a whole crew of these are either free men of color or runaway slaves or a combination of the two. And in fact, it's really interesting. That fellow right there on the handle of the shovel, it says US. So this was like government issue. And you can see that fellow there, he's got a frying pan on this extended handle and buckets and tools. And it's just whatever was needed to help further the war effort. And men like this pitched in. But serving in a civilian capacity behind the lines was one thing, but it was also, again, understood that the cause of abolitionism to press home the idea that these black men were the equivalent of white men on and off the battlefield. You had to get them into uniform and get them to fight. And in a number of places, it started to happen, but it was happening very haphazardly. It just occurred because there were people on the scene to want to make it happen, and there were men available to fill up such a unit. One of the first really successful efforts was down here in New Orleans, and this was the raising of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Louisiana Native Guards. And what this was these were units of black troops that were raised in New Orleans after Benjamin Butler and Farragut took the city in April of 1864. In a letter to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, General Butler said, "Send me troops, and if you don't," he said, "I will call upon Africa." And he kept that promise. And so what will happen is, in September of 1862, the 1st Regiment will be raised, and in October the 2nd, November the 3rd, and May of 63, we'll see the 4th Regiment of the Louisiana Native Guards come together, and they will form what they refer to as the Corps d'Afrique. And they will be part of the army run by General Nathaniel Banks down here in the Gulf area. And the reason why part of this was so possible was it was Louisiana. See, because of the Latin heritage you have between French rulership and Spanish rulership, the ideas about color lines and color barriers was a little more flexible than you would find in the places elsewhere in the slaveholding South. In the Spanish and French empires, they had slaves and they had color lines and so forth, but there tended to be a case where free people of color, especially if they were successful and had status and standing in their community, also the Spanish and the French also had their color lines too, so depending on the shade and the complexion, there was more acceptance, if you will, even to the point where they had colored militias in the Spanish and French times. And this is a very good example of it. This is Major Dawkins, I don't know if it's Dawkins or I knew a guy, and I said, he called his name Dawkins. Okay, Major Dawkins, thank you. Thought that'd be the case. A unit of about 200 free men of color who stood with Jackson's troops at the Battle of Chalmette Plantation. And so, so the model is there and the practice is there. It was interesting when Louisiana seceded in January of 1861, Governor Moore, Thomas Moore, called for the militia to be brought up. There was actually a Louisiana Native Guard that was actually in Confederate service. And these were, again, free men of color, sort of drawing upon this same tradition. In part because of civic virtue, in part because of expectations of the community, in part to maintain their standing. The men who would volunteer for a unit like this were usually people of higher standing within their community and understood that they had a lot on the line. Also, some of them are actually slave owners themselves, so they had even more on the line, I suppose. But the first Louisiana Native Guard Confederate was raised in the greater New Orleans area to about 1,000 men. There was another unit of about 500 in Baton Rouge and about another 500 scattered around the southern part of the state. None of them saw any fighting. The Confederate Native Guard unit disbanded on the grounds of the U.S. Mint when the Union forces showed up. And so that's one reason why when we get to the Union versions of the Native Guard, it's not a lot of free men of color. They sort of sat it out, and this was more, these units were more of runaway slaves and freed slaves than the original free men of color community in New Orleans. But they will go and form up the Louisiana Native Guards. Union, not Confederate, Union. What happens here is, though, what's going to make it really much more organized and much more standardized, because there are units of free men of color being raised in different places in South Carolina, in Kansas, in Louisiana. But what's going to really bring order out of chaos is in July of 1862, Congress is going to pass two laws that are going to really establish a pattern here. The first up on the top here is the act of confiscation. And so you can see here what it says. If you take part in the rebellion, you can face a fine up to $10,000, 10 years in prison, and by the liberation of all his slaves, if any he have, or by both said punishments at the discretion of the court. So now there's not going to be any more of this sending runaway slaves back to their southern masters because they qualify as contraband. No, these people are now freed by the Union Army and their force on the ground. And also in July of 62, you also get the Militia Act, and this is the one that says that now you can recruit black men to serve in the Union Army. And so it talks about they are supposed to receive, that all persons of color must have military service, must receive the same uniform, clothing, arms, and equipment, medical care, and so forth as regular soldiers. And this has to be ready by the first day of January 1864. And also signing bounties too that a lot of places offer too at this time to help with the recruitment. And so these two laws here set the stage for what will become known as the United States Colored Troops, the actual formations raised by the War Department to help fight the war and defeat the South. And this really accelerates matters because this is July of 1862. And then, of course, in the September of 62, at the Battle of Antietam, terrible Titanic struggle, the Confederate invasion of Maryland is turned away, and 5 days later, on the 22nd of September, Lincoln issues his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation telling the South they have 3 months to come back to the Union or he's going to free the slaves. Of course, they do not. So on the 1st of January, 1863, he issues their full-throated Emancipation Proclamation, and the war enters a whole new level and a whole new stage. And what really makes it official then is this, the 22nd of May, 1863, and this is General Orders number 143, and this is what creates the United States Colored Troops. So you see here, we're talking about organization of colored troops, and it had a specific bureau in which to do it, and then it talks about who can raise the troops, and basically it's no longer going to be all higgledy-piggledy. If there's going to be a regiment of black troops raised, then you're going to have to get War Department approval and then go for it from there. And then here, number 6 is really important. And the colored troops will be accepted by companies, to battalions, and consolidated into regiments by the adjutant general. The regiments will be numbered seriatim in the order by which they are raised. And so there you have it. And they will be designated the 33rd Regiment of United States Colored Troops. And so now it is official, and it is War Department policy, and now they will receive basically the same sort of training and equipment as white troops will. And the United States Colored Troops are supposed to include regiments of infantry, cavalry, engineer detachments, and artillerymen, both light artillery and heavy artillery. So this is all going to be a regular portion of the Army. Also, with the United States Colored Troops, the officers will be white. And it turned out there wasn't a shortage of white officers who would serve in these regiments. Also, non-commissioned officers would be mixed. Some would be white, some would be black. And then, of course, the enlisted men would be black. And this is how they will organize themselves as they go off to war. But in terms of equipment and uniforms organization, the United States Colored Troops were structured in the exact same way as the white regiments. And because the law said they will all be equal come January 1st, when the regiment started being organized in mid-1863, and it's a little more dramatic in the film Glory, but it is actually accurate, the War Department decided to stiff the black soldiers. A white private was to get $12 a month and a $3.50 monthly clothing allowance. And instead, the black troops were going to get paid $10 a month and have $3 deducted from that for their clothing allowance. So, you know, and this remained actually, this issue was not finally cleared up, and everything was made actually equal for all soldiers in the Union Army until June of '64. So this sort of rigmarole and discrimination went on for about a year, unfortunately. But, you know, hey, it's 1863. I'm not expecting miracles. But the reality of it is that you get the black regiments now being formed. The problem is also well, it's twofold. One problem is that there's also conventional wisdom that the black troops will not fight as hard as the white troops. And so some commanders, when they receive these black regiments, what they will do is they'll set them aside for guard duty, rear area, construction, support roles, logistics, and not put them into anywhere near into a fight. And again, these low expectations built upon just, you know, ingrained bigotry. It's the like I said, it's the conventional wisdom of the day. The other problem for the United States Colored Troops is that the Confederacy doesn't take too kindly to this either. And so what happens is on the 1st of May, 1863, the Confederate Congress passes what becomes known as the Retaliatory Act. And what it says is it says, if you are a white officer of black troops, you're most likely going to get executed. And if you're a black soldier, you are going to be enslaved or re-enslaved. And what happens is the Union finally responds. Well, there's quicker than that, but the official response will come from President Lincoln on the 30th of July, and it's called the Act of Retaliation of 1863. And in it, the federal policy is stated, if we hear of any Union prisoners being executed, for everyone that you execute, we're going to take out a rebel prisoner and execute them. And for every black troop that you turn back into a slave, or you turn into a slave, we're going to take one rebel prisoner and put them on hard labor. And basically what this does is that puts that fire out. But still, what happens is that as the war grinds on, what will happen is the Confederates will refuse to exchange black prisoners. And so basically, prisoner exchanges sort of just kind of fade from happening as we go into the last part of 1863 until the rest of the war. So that's how you end up with places like Andersonville in Georgia or Camp Douglas in Illinois, where a lot of men will end up just sort of, rotting on the vine because they're stuck in these impossibly bad conditions and they perish for their troubles. But it was the Confederates who decided, no, we're not going to exchange black prisoners. And so the North pretty much put an end to the process also. And fairly short-sighted, because the Confederacy was far shorter in terms of men and could probably do better from the prisoner exchanges, but their prejudice has blinded them to that strategic reality. As far as actual fights, the first documented action involving black troops was before all this happened. This was a unit of Kansas volunteers, black troops from the state of Kansas volunteering for action. This is the skirmish at a place called Island Mound in Missouri, 29th of October, 1862. And what happened here was it was a group of about 250 black troops, and they were in a fight with about 350 Confederates. The Confederates had the numbers, but these were partisan rangers, so they were on horseback, and most of their weaponry was pistols, swords, and some shotguns. The black troops had the advantage of they had Austrian and Prussian muskets with bayonets. And so what happened was that they had greater range and so could keep the rebels more at bay. And when it did get in close, the black troops with bayonets on their rifles held their own very well and defeated the rebels. And if the casualty rates was about 5-1 in favor of the black soldiers. So when met by a stand-up fight, they held up very well and actually prevailed and carried the day. But again, this is a mere skirmish, and this is before the more uniform practices of the War Department are kicking in. But it represents these men standing up and fighting for their country and fighting for their freedoms. The first acknowledged real battle, not a skirmish, but a true battle in which black troops will take part, will be the famous siege of Port Hudson. Port Hudson is, well, it's gone now. It used to be a little river town north of Baton Rouge, and it's sort of Louisiana's response to Vicksburg. It's not as well known and it's not nearly as big, and like I said, the town doesn't exist anymore. But the Confederates had set themselves up at Port Hudson with fortifications and artillery to help control the Mississippi River, much with the idea behind like a place like Vicksburg. And you can see you had this bend in the river here, which was great for the port because the river would sort of slow and allowed for riverine traffic. But you see these redoubts here. This was where the Confederates put up a number of heavy guns, and this would, the shipping on the Mississippi, you couldn't really get past that without probably paying a very heavy price. So what's going to happen is Nathaniel P. Banks, who replaced General Butler down in New Orleans, is going to march up with an army of about 35 to 40,000 men, and he's going to besiege Port Hudson, oh, I'm losing my power, no, oh my goodness. It's my lightsaber, it's my academic lightsaber. Well, so much for that. And so what happened here was there's about 7,500 rebels inside, and there's about 35 to 40,000 Yankees outside, including, well, shoot, can I do it? Right there, okay. You see where it says Paine? Right in that area is where the Corps d'Afrique, the 4 regiments of the Louisiana Native Guard, are established. And what happens is so they're part of the siege lines. This began on the 22nd of May, and on the 27th of May, Banks ordered sort of a general assault on all parts of the Confederate lines. And so you can see they attack in the north, they attack in the east, and they attack in the south, in all sort of a rolling battle to sort of find a soft spot in the Confederate lines, stretch out the Confederate defenders, and break in and take the place. It didn't happen. All the Union attacks were repulsed. The Louisiana Native Guards went in there here on the eastern side there where you see, like I said, where you see the name Paine, and they were part of the second round of assaults. It's like, well, the boys are attacking on the north, now the men on the east go in, let's just keep pushing and punching until we break through. And the Native Guards, they went straight at the rebel lines, very brave, and made several charges on the rebel lines, but they could not close. They had this really great picture, and it's very dramatic. It's not accurate, but it's dramatic, because they did not get the chance. They did not close with the Confederates. The cannon and musket fire was too hot, and then one of the problems was that one of the Native Guard regiments had this really beloved captain who was like, "Come on, men, follow!" And when he fell, the attack really lost its heart, and they fell back. But what happened was it demonstrated that these men could do what was expected of them and more, and that is go straight at the enemy and try to bring the fight to them. And like I said, every Union assault on Port Hudson this day, the 27th of May, they all failed. The Confederate defenses were very well sighted, and they were very well armed, and the garrison commander was a very cagey and capable general, and the Union attack completely failed. Port Hudson will fall, but it'll fall by siege, not by assault, when it's all said and done. But they made a name for themselves, and people took notice that these men can and will fight. It was really interesting. The captain who fell was from New Orleans, and they had a big funeral for him, and they brought his body back and gave him a big funeral to honor his sacrifice down back in the city. And also, I forgot to mention, but the second, I think it was the first of the 2nd Regiment of Native Guards, PBS Pinchback was one of the officers and helped raise that unit too, which is, I think, pretty interesting in its own way. But what will happen is they will be there, those Native Guards will be there when the fortress falls on the 9th of July, 5 days after Vicksburg. And so what's really important about that is that with Vicksburg and Port Hudson both falling, and Baton Rouge and New Orleans have also fallen, as has Memphis, and what happens now is the Union has basically free navigation of the entirety of the Mississippi River. Huge strategic advantage for the North. Then the following month in June, you're going to get the second major battle for black troops, and it's also here in Louisiana, but it's on the west bank of the river at a place called Milliken's Bend. And man, I really didn't want this to fail me now, but it is, okay, you see that really twisty bend with the extra channel way up in the top left-hand corner, okay? And you see the writing in the river? That's Milliken's Bend, okay? Now I'll have to get new batteries. That's Milliken's Bend. What happened was the Union siege of Vicksburg was on. You can see it right there in the middle, was on. And so Edmund Kirby Smith on the west bank of the Mississippi River, tried to organize several attacks on Union garrisons that were already on the west side of the Mississippi, with the idea that if you roused out the Yankees enough or caused them enough trouble, it might cause Grant to divert troops from the siege itself, maybe help relieve the siege in some form or fashion, but give the defenders of Vicksburg some relief from the other side of the river. And he envisioned 3 attacks on Yankee outposts on the west bank of the river. One didn't materialize. The Confederate commander came up and said, no, not today. The second one was like a night skirmish, and just there was a couple people wounded or killed on each side. But in Milliken's Bend, a Confederate brigade of 1,500 men marched up on this defensive position. Basically what the Federals had done was they built a defensive position with their back to the river, and they had, embankments and dug it, they dug themselves in facing outward, and then they had the river behind them by which they could receive supplies or move around or whatever via the river. A fellow named Henry McCulloch led the Confederates, and he marched up with 1,500 men. There was about 1,100 Yankees inside Milliken's Bend. Part of them were white troops, part of them were black troops. And the rebels went straight at them and went right in, and the white troops broke pretty quickly and started to leave the field, and the rebels had got into the position. The black troops, even though they were a green unit, they stood, they fought, they held on, and Confederates almost won. And then what happened was at the moment of their victory, and there's a neat little, this one is actually accurate. It was a close quarter fighting. But then what happened was the rebels, as they neared the victory, they topped the levee. And in the waters right off of Milliken's Bend was the USS Choctaw, an ironclad. And the great thing about a ship is you can put much bigger cannons on a floaty thing rather than on a little wheelie thing you drag around with mules. And so these really massive cannons, basically one big cannonade, and the Confederate forces were broken and they left the field. It tore them up so much and broke their morale. They left the field and left the Union troops in charge of the position. So big victory there. And the 2 interesting things to come out of Milliken's Bend is one, Henry McCulloch himself, the Confederate commander, said, oh yeah, the white troops, they ran. The black troops, and this is his direct quote, fought with great obstinacy. So they held their ground, and they were, like I said, they were green, which is really interesting, but they held their ground and went through the day. The other thing that's interesting about Milliken's Bend is that somewhere in there, not quite sure, but it doesn't look good, but somewhere in there, 2 white officers who were taken prisoner disappeared. And there's no real definitive proof on anything. The Confederate commander who was over McCulloch said, no, we didn't do that. But then he kind of admitted that maybe it did happen. But what happens is and this was really interesting, is Kirby Smith is operating already under the act of the Retaliatory Act. Well, his Union equivalent on the other side, of course, is Grant. And so this is 6 weeks before Lincoln's act of retaliation. Grant contacted Kirby Smith and said, you shoot our prisoners, we shoot your prisoners. And so even before Lincoln said, we're not going to accept this, Grant, on his own recognizances, made it a point to tell Kirby Smith that you do this, we will retaliate. There will be retaliation, blood for blood. And interestingly enough, Kirby Smith told his commanders, don't do this. Just take him prisoner and we'll figure it out. But so early on, there was this terrible moment, shrouded in mystery, but when it came right down to it, it's like, no, this isn't the way we should be doing this. And so it stopped. Then that was June, and then it's really interesting. Then in July of '63, so there's this really, so you have the assault on Port Hudson in May, and then you have Milliken's Bend in June. And now you have the most famous of all the fights that the USCT were in. Again, probably because of the movie Glory, which is actually historically pretty accurate. I'm very hard to please when it comes to war movies, and they do that movie does a really fine job. And I give them high points for that. But what you have is July 18th, 1863, and either it's the Second Battle of Fort Wagner, or you can call it the assault on Battery Wagner. But what it was Battery Wagner was part of the fortifications on the approaches to Charleston. So you could well imagine that the Union would be really keen on taking this position and closing in on come on, Charleston, this is the very heart of secession, right? And so what you have is, it was a nighttime assault on this fortress, and it's right there in the water side. So the Union Navy pounded the fort for like 4 days. But again, you bring in those warships with those really big cannons, the idea is they could make some sort of impression. And the 54th led the way. Now, in the movie, they have the colonel saying, we want the honor of leading the way. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but the 54th Massachusetts led the way. What's interesting about the 54th Massachusetts is not only is it probably the most famous USCT regiment, but actually it was raised as a state regiment. There's actually 6 regiments of black troops raised by various states before the War Department stepped in. And now they will become amalgamated into the United States Colored Troops, but the 54th Massachusetts was actually just another state regiment, like any others. But again, with the same organization, white officers, white and black non-commissioned officers, and black enlisted men. And of course, being up in Massachusetts, these are all free men of color. And so what happens is they lead the assault. And again, you know, it's a tough bill to fill, because you can see what happens is the soldiers, okay, that's when it says low water, that's the Atlantic, okay? So the regiment has to compact down because that's swamp on the other side, that's marsh, and then the water. So some of the troops actually had to make it, go through the surf and then spread out and then hit Fort Wagner from that angle there. And this, like I was saying, this picture is a lot more accurate than the one from Milliken's Bend, because the 54th Massachusetts did get to the first line of the Confederate defenses, and there was like real close-in fighting. And the major, or Major Shaw, Colonel Shaw, but Shaw, the commander of the regiment, I guess Colonel Shaw, thank you, was mortally wounded trying to take the position. And the fellow holding the regimental colors actually got the Medal of Honor, because he saw the color bearer get dropped, so he went and picked up the flag. He was wounded like 3 times and still brought the flag back with him, and he got the Medal of Honor for his efforts eventually. But what will happen here is just like in some of these other places, in this time and place, the technology is that a dug-in defender with rifled weapons and a determination not to be moved is generally not going to get moved. And so what will happen is it's a masterful display of bravery and perseverance, but they don't carry the position. Some of the units that came behind them got a little further into the Confederate position because there was a confusion in the Confederate command, but eventually the Confederates rallied and counterattacked and drove all the Union troops out. But what happens here is an event like this is the kind of thing that really captured a lot of people's imaginations. And what this does is stories like Fort Wagner helps with things like recruitment, for example. 3 other actions that I want to share with you, and then I'll do a wrap up. But because I think there's one that's really interesting. And then there's two that, well, there's one as well. I'll explain them when we get to them. Because one of the other things that happens in these early actions, there's all these questions about, like, was there, like, for example, in Milliken's Bend, some people said that the rebels came in under a black flag and no quarter. But eventually, the reality of it is there are documented cases of atrocities. And that doesn't really surprise anybody, really, when you consider the time and the place. Another really interesting fight for the United States colored troops was a place called Oluste. And what's so interesting about Oluste is Oluste happens to have the distinction of being the biggest battle in the Civil War fought in Florida. And by big, we mean 5,500 Northerners versus 5,000 Southerners. So, basically two small divisions. But what happened was a fellow named Seymour, the North had taken Jacksonville and set it up as a base. He decided to go into the interior on some sort of like raid or reconnaissance and force, and he was not meeting any opposition. He thought, you know what, maybe we'll just march all the way to Tallahassee. Baton Rouge has fallen, and Little Rock has fallen, and Nashville's fallen, and let's see if we can add, Tallahassee to the list. Well, what happened was on his way to Tallahassee, his intelligence was a little faulty, and he ran into 5,000 Confederates under a fellow named Finnegan, and Finnegan was quite an active commander and quite a tactician, and so you can see how the red lines go. It went very poorly, and the Yankee forces were defeated and had to retreat all the way back to Jacksonville. But USCT soldiers were there. What's the curious part about it is, of course, is that also, like here, some of these other actions, there was accusations of atrocities committed by Southern soldiers against black soldiers, whether they were wounded or trying to surrender or captured or whatever. Nothing is definitive up to this point. But then you have 2 months later, the massacre, not a battle, it's a massacre at Fort Pillow. This is the 12th of April, 1864. And what happened here was Fort Pillow was a Union position north, basically due north, following the Mississippi River to Memphis. So it's in Tennessee, heading towards the Kentucky-Missouri border. And what happened here was it was a combined white and black units, Union unit organization, and the Confederates overran it, and then the soldiers, it's like just a mass psychotic break. They just slaughtered almost all the black troops, no matter whether they were surrendering or not. And they also murdered a bunch of white soldiers who were also trying to surrender. And it's all documented. Whereas you can say, well, supposedly at Oluste this, or at Milliken's Bend there's a black flag. Maybe, maybe not. But this is undeniable. The biggest debate about what happened at Fort Pillow was it condoned by the officers on hand, or was it just simply in the heat of battle, everything just got, just went completely haywire, and just the ferocity and the hatreds just were able to take hold? That's a debate that is still going on to this day. But the reality of it is, it happened, and it is a truly dishonorable and grotesque moment from the Civil War. But it did take place, and there's no gainsaying that. Then there's one last action I'd like to share with you about the USCT, and this was a really interesting one. And this is where they actually fought in their largest numbers in a single battle, as far as I can tell, because it was an entire division of 8 regiments of United States colored troops. And this was the Battle of the Crater, okay? And this was in July of 1864. Was it the 30th? 30th? Come on. 30th. I did have it right. Ha ha. Oh, my goodness. I can't remember half my students' names, but I remember that. Now I do know my students. If any of my students are out, I know your names. All right, but what happened here is this was at the siege of Petersburg. And this was really interesting. In Burnside's Corps, they came up with a really clever idea. Hey, we have all these coal miners from Pennsylvania. Bingo. And so they dug this tunnel under the rebel lines, because it was siege lines. It was very sort of like, hey, World War I's coming, everybody. And it was a siege with trenches. And so the Yankees dug under the rebels' lines, and they put 4 tons of gunpowder under, and then they touched it off. And you see that big white cloud up at the top there? That's it. Well, then what was supposed to happen was this. Okay, we have to blow this big hole in the Confederate lines, and we're going to run 2 major units into the battle. And you can see where it says Ferrero, and you see all those, you see how it says CT at the end? That doesn't mean Connecticut. That means the 30th United States Colored Troops. So it was 8 full regiments, a full division. We're going to take part in this assault. The line's going to be ruptured. The rebels are going to be stunned, punch through, and then spread out, and then more troops will fall in behind you. And the truth be told, this could have ended the war. Because if this would have succeeded, Richmond would have fallen in August of '64. And for all intents and purposes, that would have been it. Unfortunately for everybody involved, it was a giant failure. And not for the want of trying, but it was bad, just really, really bad. There was, for example, they were like, well, who do we send in? What division will lead the way? And they were like drawing straws to try to figure out what division will spearhead this, and things like that. And then at the last minute, Burnside's commander was George Meade, the hero of Gettysburg. And when Meade heard about the plans, he ordered all sorts of changes to the plans. And some of them went through and some of them were ignored. And a lot of Union officers, especially at the staff level, weren't really quite sure if A came after B or B came after A or whatever. And so what happened was, when the battle took place, there wasn't an immediate exploitation of the crater, and it did what it was supposed to do. It went kablooey and sent a couple hundred rebels, off and away. But instead, this is what happens. It becomes the Battle of the Crater. And what happened was a lot of Union troops, they went forward, and what they did was they went down into the crater and came up on that side, and were using the lip of the crater as cover, to be able to fire at the rebels from a semi-covered position. It's basically just for them, it's just a giant foxhole. Well, the problem is that other units that are supposed to support them, and there were some Irish regiments from like New York that were there too. I mean, there were other people, but the whole Yankee assault just sort of fell apart into confusion. And then one of the problems is that the man in charge of this division, Ferrero, he was back in a dugout drinking whiskey with another one of the divisional generals. Let me take you back. You see where it says Ledley right there? Well, he was another divisional commander, and he and Ferrero and Ledley were in a dugout drinking when the battle was going on. And what happened was, to make it even worse for the North, was that the Confederate general on hand was a guy named William Mahone, and he was varsity. And so what happened was, he very quickly got over the shock of the explosion, organized a powerful counterattack, and you see what happens is that on the ridge there, most of those are rebels. You see that one American flag in the center, and you can see that green banner right there to the left of the American flag. That's an Irish regiment. Bless you. And the rebels counterattacked and pushed them back. The problem was a lot of Union soldiers who went back down into the crater, and what happens here is this is also completely documented. The Confederate soldiers were not taking any black prisoners. And now this was just out of control, hatred and heat of battle kind of moment. This is just blood fury. Because after the battle was all, basically for all intents and purposes, is over and the Confederates had won, Mahone rode up and down the lines and ordered his men to stop and to start taking prisoners. But before it was all said and done, the colored troops that went in there, they were just a number of the regiments were just torn to ribbons between the initial battle trying to close with them, and then the Confederate fury at these fellows. It was literally a case of like sort of fish in a barrel. It ended Ambrose Burnside's career. He was basically set aside, and it was interesting. What happened was Meade sort of threw Burnside under the court-martial bus, but later on people realized that Burnside really wasn't to blame. It was really Meade, and so Meade's reputation took a real hit. But by the time this all had happened, the war was over. Burnside's career was done, as was whatever's left of his reputation. But it was it was a really interesting idea, very much amazing potential for what it could do to shorten the war with a Union victory in the summer of '64. But we know that's not what took place. This is what took place. In the end, everybody, United States colored troops or their predecessors took part in 41 major battles during the course of the Civil War. Approximately 178,000 men served in 175 USCT units. Again, whether it was infantry, cavalry, artillery, or engineers. In fact, it was at Fort Pillow, the black troops were artillerymen, as a matter of fact. But they served in all these fights and all these places. And so I think it's really interesting. They even were at Palmetto Creek, which is Palmetto Ranch, which was like right at the end of the war and that kind of stuff. Really interesting stuff way out in Texas. Yeah, right down there. And they showed that they were men, and they showed that they were American men. And that's kind of what really mattered when it really came down to it. It was interesting. Butler had a specific medal cast for his soldiers who came to his call, and it's interesting. In Latin it reads, "Freedom will be theirs by the sword," which I think is pretty accurate. When the war was over, the USCT were quickly disbanded and demobilized, as was most of the Union Army. The Union Army dropped down really, really quickly. These men wanted to go home, and they did. And they did go home, and they did receive War Department pensions, which I think is pretty noteworthy in its own way. In 1867, the War Department, as they shrink the Army down, they still decided to keep 4 regiments of black troops in terms of the infantry. And so they had the 31st to the 41st Infantry, 38th to the 41st Infantry Regiments, and the cavalry was the 9th and 10th Cavalry, whom the Buffalo Soldiers, they will hang around. Then in '69, the Army shrank again, and so what happened was now there's only 25 regiments of infantry in the U.S. Army. The 24th and the 25th Infantry Regiments will be black troops, and they will still maintain the 10 cavalry regiments, with the 9th and 10th being black troopers. And by the way, the pensions were the same, which I think is pretty noteworthy and pretty decent of them to do that. And this is really cool. This is I found a number of pictures like this. These are veterans marching several years later in sort of a Memorial Day or Veterans Day parade, which I think is pretty awesome. In fact, the North started holding these kind of Veterans Day parades as early as like 1868, like in an official capacity, which I think is pretty noteworthy. And And then also, again, I don't mean to short them in any way, but I understand there's also time. There was also approximately about 18,000 free men of color who served in the United States Navy. And 18,000, that's a good commitment, because the U.S. Navy grew to about 900 warships. Now, of course, many of those were lost over the course of the war, but the Navy had over 900 commissioned warships in their arsenal. And you had quite a few black sailors serve on board, of course, as enlisted men. There were no black officers, but they did serve on board. And the truth of the matter is black sailors in service were always, that goes back to Revolutionary War days. American warships, all the way back to E.S.E.C. Hopkins and all that stuff, you could find black sailors aboard U.S. warships all the way to the present. It's just when you get to the American Civil War, because the Navy grows so large, that you have this really big uptick in black men volunteering for naval service. And so it's about 10%, 178,000, about 18,000. So about 1 in 10 would end up serving in the Navy. But yeah, so again, not to not to do them, not give them the short end of the stick. There you go, that's what I was thinking. They're part of the story too, of course. But it's 8 o'clock already, so I know better. All righty, so may I take any questions, please? Questions? Anybody?
What year is this photo from?
These photos, these will be from the Civil War period, 1861 to 65. And you can tell by his uniform that he's a sailor rather than a soldier, yeah. And, but yeah. Sailors had to wear clothing that was a lot looser, because that way if you fell in the water, you had more mobility, so you wouldn't, you could stay afloat. Bell bottoms were originally designed to help sailors not drown. Another question, please. Anybody? Yes, sir.
Do you have any knowledge of the Fort Pillow massacre leading to the United States participating in a what would become the Geneva Convention, the first meeting?
That's a really good, I don't know, because that's a really good point, because this is just at the same time. In all honesty, I didn't notice that, but I'm sure that, I don't doubt that that's not part of the story.
Supposedly, it angered Lincoln so much that he decided to send someone, and that initially...
Because wasn't the first one in 1864? Yeah. Okay.
It was for the ethical treatment
right.
of prisoners of war.
Yeah. Well, that had the Second War of Italian Unification with the battles in 1859 that helped jumpstart the Red Cross. Was this thing about what happens after the battle? What happens to all these fellows that are wounded or captured and all that kind of stuff, and the treatment of those? That doesn't, I didn't see that, but you know what? That makes perfect sense to me. But in all honesty, it got past me. I was running short on time. so sorry. Yeah, please, no. I guarantee you. I teach full time at Haynes Academy, so I'm always somewhere. So, but yes. That I can't imagine that's not the case. That makes perfect sense to me, because it was 64. Yeah, very cool. Yes, sir.
You have to just respectfully disagree.
Oh, no.
The Native Guard never served a day in Confederate service.
Right, no.
The Native Guard never was called up. And there were two brigades, there were two units in New Orleans that were never called up, although they existed. The European Brigade and the Native Guard.
Right.
The Native Guard was the only service that they did was for 5 days between the time that the Federals made it past the forts and when Butler arrived.
Right.
They served a grand total of 5 days
right.
as a police force in the Mountie.
Right.
They never fired a shot.
Well, that makes sense, because they disbanded.
But you hear that a lot when people say they were Confederate.
Right.
They never serve a minute in Confederate service.
Right, it was in state service.
It was in state service.
Yeah,
It was-
and they disbanded on the grounds of the mint, so that makes sense about the
And
Marigny.
the other
So,
thing was,
yeah, interesting.
The European Brigade was responsible for the French Quarter and the Warehouse District, and then the Native Guard was right. But again, if you read all the newspaper, there's no newspaper article. They talk about the Native Guard, the fact that they can march, the fact that they're professional.
Right.
But they never served a day.
Well, the fact that you'd have, 1,000 free men of color armed and uniformed in a southern state is pretty, that kind of really sort of stands out.
Any arms available.
Yes.
Again, they, but like
Yeah.
I say, most of the other regiments, as they were formed, they were advertised in the paper for recruits. They formed them up as soon as they went through the training, and then they were called into Confederate service, and then they left and went and fought in Mississippi.
Wherever they got sent off to,
The
yeah.
Guard never.
Oh, no, they were here, they were just here in the city. Yeah, I knew that, right. Another question, very good. Yes, sir.
Or simply a comment, the commander of the Confederates at Fort Pillow was
Forrest.
Miss Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Yes, yeah. Well, and that's one of the things where some people said that he ordered it and other people said that he didn't. So, but
Pretty fair chance he probably
yeah.
let it occur.
My guess is, well, even if he didn't order it, yes, he would let it happen. That wouldn't surprise me at all. Yes, sir.
We visited Chalmette Cemetery, battlefield, and
Yes.
the whole section of USCT troops.
Yes, interesting. Yeah, very cool. Well, it's a federal cemetery, isn't it? Yeah.
Right.
Yep. So yeah, very interesting. Our casualties on that day in 1814 were pretty light, fortunately. But later on, you do your service and you can be buried in a military cemetery like that. That's very cool. Anybody else? Yes, please. Thank you. Anybody? All right. Well, Superior. Well, thank you all for your time and trouble. And thank you for coming out. Very gracious of you. Oh, and